So at the moment in our application, we can fetch recipes, but as soon as we try to visit one, we'll get an error because we're failing to load the ingredients here, but the bigger problem is that we're failing to load the overall recipe details. The reason for that is that if we have a look at our recipe detail component here, we are of course still fetching our recipe here with get recipe from our recipes service. But we now no longer load our recipes into the recipes service, we instead load them into NGRX. Because, not here, but because in the data storage service we dispatch the loaded recipes with set recipes, and that of course uses NGRX. Hence, the goal has to be that we also fetch our recipes on the detail and then also on the edit component from our store. And for that, we'll have to rewrite our logic there a little bit. Because at the moment, our logic is such that we basically load our recipes, or we loaded our recipes in the service, in the recipes service, and then we stored them here in that recipes array in the service so that we thereafter could simply access the recipes from that array with get recipes or get recipe. That's not how NGRX works. There we always access the store and the data in it by using select, and we always get back an observable. So we have no synchronous call as we have it here to get back a recipe. We always get back an observable that might then give us a recipe depending on what we select. Even if that happens almost instantly, it's still technically an observable. So therefore, we first of all will have to inject our store here into the recipe detail component, and then we can see how we proceed regarding that. So I'll inject my store, import it from @ngrx store. We'll also need to get information about our app store, our app store structure by importing that information from the root store file and the app store folder and the app reducer file. And then here we can assign this generic from app state type as we did it before. Okay, so now we know more about our store. Now here we have a problem. Getting the route params already is done through an observable. So now we want to add yet another observable to then take these route params and get our recipe. Now, the first way of how we could do this would be that we create a new observable chain inside of that function we passed to subscribe of that outer chain, where we select our recipes part of the store, and then we can use pipe here on this inner observable, now on this selection observable, to transform the data we're getting with map, and for that we need map from RxJS operators. And we need map because here we get our recipes state, and what we really want in the end, of course, is a single recipe for that given ID. So here we can then simply return recipes state recipes, and here, as I said, I want a single recipe. We can use find for that, and find takes a function where we get each recipe but also the index of each recipe, and we here want to find the recipe where the index of the element we're currently looking on at with that find method, where that index is equal to this ID. So this could be our logic for retrieving one recipe. Now here I'm just mapping this, so now we can subscribe, we can subscribe on that inner observable, so on that store selection observable. At this point we will get a single recipe, and then we could say this recipe equals recipe. So now we're taking advantage of this store observable. Let's save this and let's see if it works, if this reloads. First of all, we now need to fetch data, and then here, that looks good. So this works. A more elegant way of handling this would be to convert this all into one big observable chain, even though you can also leave it like this and could use it like that. But if you wanted to convert it to one larger observable chain, then you would have to call pipe on that params observable here and add a map operator as your first operator. Here you then get this params object, which we previously got in subscribe. We will change our subscribe logic soon. And there I want to return plus params ID to get that ID. And in the next step, we would add a switch map to switch our observable from the route params observable to the store observable. Here we would get the ID and we would return this store select recipes in the end to kick off that store observable for the recipe slice. And thereafter, in yet another next step, we would use map here. So let's cut that and remove that pipe method therefore. We would add map as yet another step in this main pipe here. However, here we get the recipe state, but this ID is now not set at this point here. To set it, we can set it here in the switch map. We can set this ID equal to ID because we're getting the ID here as an argument thanks to map. Now this ID is available here and we can filter on our recipe state for that single recipe. And last but not least, now we have a subscribe function here with one too many closing parentheses. Now we have a subscribe function here where we get our single recipe. So now if we save that, we should have the same setup where we can now fetch recipes and still view the details with this observable chain. The same approach, or a relatively equal approach, can be used on the recipe edit page. There we also load a recipe when we initialize the forum, and this now also has to be done with the help of our store observable. So just as on the detail page, let's start by injecting the store here, imported from @ngrx store of course, and let's also import everything as from app from our store app reducer file to assign that generic type here from app state. And now down there where we previously selected our recipe like this, that won't work anymore. Instead here we now select the recipes on our store. And then again we can use pipe here and add the map operator, which you still need to import from RxJS operators of course. And with the map operator added here, we again get our recipe state at this point. We're only interested in a single recipe though. Hence in here we can return recipe state.recipes and then find a single recipe. And then again here we get a recipe and the index passed in automatically into this function we passed to find. And we want to return true if the index matches this.id, so the ID we extracted from the route params in ng-on-init. Since we do call init forum inside of our subscription here, this is fine and we can rely on the ID being set at this point of time. So now here we basically return a single recipe. In the next step, we can now use that recipe. And therefore, the next step is to subscribe. We get our recipe here. And now all that code that relies on the recipe, so all this code here, has to be moved into the subscription because only in there our recipe is available. Let's give this a try. Let's fetch our data and let's try editing a recipe. And this looks quite good. Now, changing this or saving changes won't work yet because we're not handling this through NGRX at this point, but we can load the details, which is looking pretty good. Again, of course, changing anything here will not have any effect because we're not using NGRX for saves right now. Of course, we have a problem if I reload whilst I'm on such a detail page, though. There, we don't really load that data. So that will be the next step, that we can also reload these pages. And that is simply related to our resolver not working correctly.